Well, good morning. Good morning, everybody. It's very odd talking to you when I can't see anyone that's there, but it's very nice to be here and to welcome you to the first of what I think will be quite a series of webinars that we are running here from the IFS on some of the issues that are the economic issues that are being raised by the coronavirus. Before I introduce this particular webinar, let me encourage you to look at the IFS website, where we have published more than 30 pieces in the last 6 weeks, looking at everything from the inequality issues associated with this to how you might measure inflation under the circumstances, to issues around ethnicity, to issues, some stuff today we're putting out around transport and commuting, and of course all of the issues that we're talking about today, which are around how we might get the economy somewhat back to normal, how we might start to move out of lockdown and get the UK back to work. Today, two of my colleagues will be presenting. First, Rachel Griffith, who is Research Director at the IFS and is also, I think, recent past president, it's called, of the Royal Economic Society. Rachel will kick this off with 10 minutes of overview, looking at how the government should be thinking about getting us back to work. And then Rob Joyce, who is Deputy Director at the IFS, will look at some of the data telling us about some of the issues that are likely to be faced, and putting some numbers around some of the choices that government will have. I think between them, they'll speak for around about 25 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. If you want to ask questions, I think you email events@ifs.org.uk. Thank you very much, and I will now hand over to Rachel.
So hi, everyone. Rob, can we go to the next slide? So as Paul said, I'm Rachel Griffith, the Research Director of the IFS, and I want to start just by saying I hope that you're all well and staying safe. So we're currently at the start of what will probably be one of the deepest recessions in living memory, and the government faces the daunting task of navigating a route out of lockdown to restart the economy. So one of the first steps in restarting the economy is going to be getting people back to work, but getting people back to work both safely and productively. So in doing so, the government faces some very difficult trade-offs, and those, even worse than the normal situation where the government has to trade off costs and benefits. Most of these costs and benefits, we have very little knowledge about what the scale of them are, who's going to bear the costs, who's going to reap the benefits. So what are some of those big trade-offs that we need to face? What are the costs of remaining in lockdown, both in terms of the mental and physical health costs of remaining in lockdown? What are the economic costs? Who's bearing the brunt of those costs? What are the costs of easing lockdown in terms of how much that will increase, how much increasing different activities may lead to increased risk of infection? And how does that vary across different people? What are the benefits of easing lockdown? That's what we'll talk most about today, some of what the costs and benefits from an economic perspective of easing lockdown. And key to that are, if we ease lockdown in specific ways, which firms and industries are ready and able to start back up? Will some firms find that there's no market for their products, or that they're not able to source key inputs that they require? So even easing some of the lockdown rules may not lead to restarting economic activity. And from the worker side, who's ready and able to return to work? So even if the government says people can return to work, will some people fear going back to work, perhaps because they live with vulnerable relatives, they themselves are vulnerable? Or will they face some constraints, such as needing to care for children or not having means to travel to work safely? Will some people want to return to work but not have jobs because their industries shut down, or face restrictions, perhaps because of arrangements that their firm has put in place as part of a furlough scheme? The other big type of uncertainty that we face is how long do we expect this social distancing to be required? So as an employer, how much do I invest in reorganizing my business or accommodating workers from working from home? And as a worker, how much do I change my life in order to accommodate social distancing? Is this a temporary issue, so something I just need to live with for a month or two? Or is this here to stay for a long time, in which case I might take larger investments to rearrange the way that work happens? So these are really difficult questions, and we can't possibly have all the answers to them. So there are some sense in which scientists and academics can work to understand better the answers to these questions, but we're never going to fully know the answer to these questions. And so what we need to think about is designing and implementing policy in the face of this considerable uncertainty. And that's a real challenge. So in this talk, what we're going to do is try and consider this unusual situation and provide a few insights from economics about how, specifically focusing on the problem we face right now, how we get people back into work. We're not going to talk about very specific policies, but we're going to talk more generally about some of the trade-offs that government faces and how we can think about that. So next slide. Yeah, thanks. So at the core of this issue that's led to the lockdown is that the actions of an individual person have very important impacts on other people. So what economists refer to as externalities. So most specifically, my behavior will affect the likelihood that you get infected. If I go meet my friend and interact with them and they have COVID-19, and then I go and meet you, that increases your chance of being infected. So that's a classic externality. When there are externalities like this, we know that people taking decisions individually don't necessarily fully account for these external costs. And actually, in this instance, they may not even fully be aware of what those external costs are. And so government wants to encourage people to act in ways that account for these. So of course, we deal with this situation all the time on a smaller scale through taxes and regulations on products like alcohol, petrol, cigarettes, etc. And so one thing we want to think about is what we can learn from those situations to apply to this situation. To some extent, they're similar, to some extent, they may be quite different, and we need to think about different policies. So lockdown is a very extreme form of policy, like banning teenagers from drinking alcohol. So far, we've basically banned social contact. Now the government needs to move towards allowing some types of social contact, but find policies that discourage types of social contact that are particularly risky in terms of spreading COVID. So like having regulations on how much alcohol people can drink and in what situations people can drink alcohol. Okay. So in getting people back to work, we need to find ways to adapt what we do and how we organize what we do, how we interact in the workplace, how we get to work, how we commute, how we shop, etc. So these are all sorts of innovations and investments that companies and individuals need to take. And the gains from these investments won't typically be enjoyed simply by the person taking that investment. They have these externalities on other people. So the benefit to me from staying at home and not interacting with people isn't only felt by me, it's felt by other people. So the issue is that we have this enormous uncertainty going forward. How long are we going to need to be able to do this for, etc. And that creates a real problem in thinking about the incentives that people have to invest in these rearrangement of the workforce. We know from a very large literature, looking in particular at the last recession, but in many other events, that uncertainty discourages firms and individuals from taking action and investing. And so one of the key things that governments need to think about, that the government needs to think about how to do, is to mitigate some of that. Where we want firms to take actions, policies can sometimes mitigate that uncertainty. And that will be beneficial where we can do that. So either by stating, the government is going to require social distancing for a certain amount of time, or we expect it to be, a long time rather than a short time, or by helping to underwrite some of that uncertainty. So give promises to take some of the risk away from firms if the outcome is different than we expect. Uncertainty also discourages workers from investing, for example, in finding or retraining for a new job. So policies that again can help mitigate that uncertainty, so to help subsidize it or encourage people to undertake those investments, even in the face of that uncertainty. With individuals, of course, we also want to insure them against bad outcomes. And it can be the case that this insurance disincentivizes them from finding new jobs. And we need to think about the right trade-off there. So does putting workers on furlough disincentivize them from moving out of jobs that don't have a promising future into new jobs? So we do want to provide some of that insurance, but we also want to encourage people to get back into work. So in general, there are going to be really different policies needed for different problems. Where we think firms and workers have the best information, for example, on how to organize their own workplaces, then we typically think that regulations, taxes, and subsidies are the best targeted types of policies. But where government has better information, for example, how to avoid congestion on public transport, then policy needs to be more directional. And so we need to think in each instance which types of policies are better. More directional by government, telling people more what to do, versus leaving it to individuals or firms to self-organize and providing incentives that push them in the right direction. There's also a really important role for the government in coordinating information, for example, on sharing best practices and how to socially distance in some types of workplaces, or in where there are job vacancies, what types of training is available for different types of jobs. So finally, there's been huge dislocation in the labor market. The crisis and the fast adoption of new ways of working and new technologies to facilitate social distancing, like working at home, has left a large number of workers without jobs or temporary furloughed. So millions of workers are going to need to find new jobs. In normal times, when a few people lose their job, we think individuals and firms left to their own devices do a pretty good job of getting people back into the right kinds of jobs. But when we have millions of workers needing to reallocate and entire sectors looking like they may never come back to the size that they previously were, such as the airline industry or pubs, for example, then there's an unusually strong case for the government to play a more active role than we typically see in helping the labor market to readjust. We know that large mismatches in the labor market, so large mismatches, people being in the wrong jobs, can hamper employment and economic growth. Coming out of the last big recession, the financial crisis that started in 2007-8, the UK did very poorly in terms of productivity performance, and we want to ensure that we don't repeat some of those mistakes. So policy can help to minimize the frictions in the labor market by, for instance, providing platforms for job postings and matching in specific sectors or occupation, and policies to incentivize and provide information about retraining that may facilitate the formation of new high quality matches between workers and firms. And that's really a role where we think that there could be a very active role for government to play. So I'm now going to hand over to Rob to talk through some of the facts and figures in detail and more details.
Great, thank you, Rachel. So here's an outline of what's to come in the rest of the talk. We'll start very briefly with what we know or have good reason to believe about who's already working and who's not already working, which is really key context for pretty much everything else that's to come as we think about how to move out of lockdown. And then we'll move through one by one some of the key components of the challenge of getting people working again, both safely and productively. So we'll talk about working from home, about commuting for those who don't work from home, about social distancing in the workplace for those who don't work from home, and about individual or family or household level risks or constraints to getting back to work as well. There's a fair bit more detail on all of this in the paper that we put out earlier this week, by the way. But what I'll do in each of these cases is focus on setting out some of the data that illustrates the nature of the challenge we face in each case here, what problems will need solving one way or another. And we'll use that to comment in light of some of the very important overarching principles that Rachel's already outlined on what the appropriate role of policy might be. And as I wrap up at the end, I'll come back again to some more comments on the role of policy and the key roles for government in all of this. So what is the pre-crisis workforce currently doing? I'll show you just one picture for that. There's a few I could show you. There's a few emerging data sources on this now, none of them quite perfect. This one is from the Office for National Statistics, from a business survey that it's run, showing you about who is currently furloughed. No guarantee of perfect representativeness here, by the way. In particular, this is probably going to miss a lot of firms who have already gone bust, because they're less likely to be responding to the survey. But the basic patterns, at least in terms of the variations across sectors and in the large overall number of people who have clearly had their careers disrupted, are pretty consistent across the 2 or 3 limited sources of data that we do have on this so far. So here you can see, first of all, just how many people have had their work disrupted. According to this, it's about a quarter of the total workforce are on furlough. Of course, as far as we can tell, it would seem that a number of additional people have lost jobs completely, not least given the statistics on how many new claims to benefits we've seen lately. This picture also gives you a good idea of where, of course, activities have stopped the most. And I think one thing I'll draw your attention to here is the top couple of series, the top couple of sectors there, accommodation and food and arts and entertainment. One thing that I think this forces us to think about is that if you look at the kinds of people in those sectors, it seems pretty unlikely. I think you don't have to be an epidemiologist to surmise that it seems unlikely that those people are going to be returning in very large numbers to their previous work the day after lockdown. These are not jobs that are going to be returning in large numbers immediately. We're not going to be flooding the bars and cafes again at time T+1 after the lockdown is lifted. And so that's going to be a really key issue. And in some cases, it's not going to be immediately about getting people back to work safely when lockdown ends in their previous work. We're also going to have a challenge in thinking about what to do about the large numbers of people who probably still have little or no hope of returning to their previous job for quite some time. And so we want to be on the front foot in thinking about them too, and about the barriers to them finding other work where that's appropriate, at least temporarily. Okay, and so one issue there is going to be providing the kind of certainty that we can provide. If people know that it's unlikely they're going to have their previous job for a number of months, then they're in a better position then to judge whether they think it's worth hanging on because the value of their previous employment relationship with their employer was so high, or whether it's worth reinvesting, retraining in something else and looking for another career, for example. And as Rachel's mentioned, and as we'll come back to, there may also be an important role for government in helping the labour market to adjust so that those who are looking for new work can get it as quickly as possible. But this helps to highlight, I think, some of the scale of the immediate challenge we face. And another thing to note when we're thinking about the kinds of people who are currently without work, that certainly is not random with respect to some various basic characteristics, in particular age. So about a third of workers under the age of 25 are in what we're calling here the shutdown sectors. These are basically the sectors that have been pretty much forced to stop operations. So it's things like hospitality. About a third of the youngest workers were in those sectors. So the issues I've just talked about are going to be particularly important for them. A lot of that group are not going to be seeing their previous job in all likelihood come back the day after we lift lockdown. So that just sets the scene a little bit for sort of where we are as we try to move forward. I'm now going to talk about a number of issues that are going to come up when we're thinking about getting as many people back to work safely and productively as we can. And the first is working from home. So the first thing to say about this, of course, is that as we open the economy, perhaps the most obvious way of dampening the trade-off we might face between the level of virus transmission and the level of economic activity is that where people can work from home reasonably productively, they should be doing so. This helps them, but it helps everyone else as well. It slows the rate of virus transmission. And in particular, if you think about the people who can't work from home, it helps them in that if we can keep the rate of virus transmission lower, it's less likely we'll need to enter a second lockdown, which would once again take away the livelihoods of those people who can't work from home. So this is something that's an obvious policy goal, if you like. Now here's some data on who might be able to work from home. There are, of course, constraints here which vary a lot job by job, This shows some data based on the coding of the task content of different occupations, which you can use to try to get some sense of where it looks easier and less easy to do work from home. So on this graph, each dot is an occupation, and they've been labeled here. And what we've got is an estimate of the ease of working from home in that occupation on the vertical axis, and also on the horizontal axis, a measure of average pay in that occupation as well. So you can see that leisure and travel jobs can't very easily be done from home. Many desk-based jobs towards the top can more easily be done from home. One important point here is the slope of the best fit line. So lower paid jobs tend to be harder to do from home on average. So again, so lockdowns are especially problematic for lower earners on average, which is one of the many things worth bearing in mind when we're thinking about the risk of having to have another lockdown, of course, if the virus were to spike again. And it also, of course, emphasizes the crucial role of effective insurance for those whose work is most disrupted. Now, that said, the ease of working from home is not a universal constant, of course. I mean, you can't do it if you're a truck driver, but we've already seen large-scale adaptations in a number of areas. And there are occupations, there will be occupations at the margin where adaptations and investments can be made, which will enable working from home reasonably effectively. And so that brings me to the role of policy. How should we think about the role of policy in this area? Where, again, it's one area where we need innovation. Rachel touched on this at the start. And by definition, we need innovation to enable working from home when it wasn't happening before. That doesn't have to mean innovation in the sense of inventing new machinery. It can mean, of course, reorganizing workplace practices and the way that work is organized. And so we need that to happen. And it's an example of where, in general, firms and sectors are going to be best placed to know how exactly to do that. But the government has a key role in providing the right conditions. So for one thing, certainty and some forward guidance would seem like an obvious priority here where it can be given. Right? If people mistakenly think that they're going to be filling the offices again the day after lockdown is lifted, they're not going to be making the investments to enable working from home as much as they should. Whereas if they're told now that many jobs in the desk-based economy will be expected to work from home, if at all possible, for a considerable period, well, then it's clearer to a lot of firms that investments will be worthwhile and they'll be more likely to happen. Now, second, as we've said, clearly there are benefits of working from home that go to wider society, not the firms or the people themselves. So there's also an argument here for the government to step in to sharpen up the incentives, to align them better with what's good for society. So an area where some form of subsidy scheme would be an appropriate thing to be thinking about, perhaps for the innovations or technologies themselves to subsidize those, perhaps targeted at smaller businesses who would find them harder to afford. But those are the kinds of policy areas that would be appropriate to be thinking about in this space. So that's working from home. What about commuting for those who do not work from home? So the first thing to say here is that the usual kind of calculus about the social desirability of different forms of commuting is temporarily very different. A highly contagious virus changes things. Perhaps the clearest two ends of the spectrum here are, on the one hand, peak time public transport use, which is now going to have significant negative externalities associated with it that simply don't apply in normal times when there isn't a contagious virus knocking around. And probably right at the other end of the spectrum, cycling, which looks now even more to be encouraged and safely facilitated than it was before. Well, let's look at some key facts here to try and bring out what some of the challenges are going to be. First of all, of course, London's totally different, as this picture shows. So about half of workers in London commute using, this is based on pre-crisis data, again, commute using public transport. And that compares to less than 1 in 10 of workers in the rest of the country. So that's one obvious point, is that this is largely a problem in London. Now, as I'm going to show you in a moment, actually conveniently, a lot of those people in London, it looks like, given their occupations, they could work from home instead. So that's one key way of trying to ease this issue, and I'll come back to that. But getting working from home as prevalent as it could be in London looks especially key, given what would otherwise be a potentially serious concern about how people typically have to get to work in London. Sorry, this graph actually, in fact, makes that exact point. So here you can see that of those taking public transport, given their occupation, what proportion looked like they could work from home. And you can see this is pretty high in London, about 60%, just over that, and that's higher than in any other region. Now, the other important thing to be thinking about when it comes to commuting is when people are commuting. And another really key factor is the bunching of commuting at peak times. This uses data that we've taken from a time use survey, which records how people spend their time in a very precise way throughout the day. And from that, we can actually look at when they're commuting. And I'm showing you the proportion of people who are commuting at each time of day, both in London, the South East specifically, and then in the rest of the UK. And so there's a lot of peak time commuting. Again, in London especially, actually, this is an issue. About 20% of London workers London or South East workers are commuting at 8:30 a.m. in normal times. So spreading out people's commuting times even a bit could make quite a big difference to the safety of commuting in London. Of course, actually, even when people don't use public transport, this graph's quite important and revealing as well, because it also, of course, suggests that there's a lot of co-location in the workplace. Given the bunching of commuting times, there's also, by implication, quite a lot of bunching in when people are at work, in particular between the two spikes here, okay, which obviously raises another issue, which I'll come to in a minute, about what people are doing in the workplace. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So what about policy here? So for policy, this is partly going to come back to encouraging enabling working from home, as I've mentioned. It's partly going to be about getting the incentives to commute in different ways, better align with the temporary, very new reality that we face about the relative desirability of different modes of transport. That, by the way, that does not have to imply price rises for any particular commuting group. I think I've seen some misunderstanding of that point. That could mean subsidizing cycling more than we do. It could mean reducing off-peak fares. It's relative prices that matter for people's incentives to commute in different ways. But clearly, that's one set of things to be thinking about. That the calculus has changed about how much we should want to be encouraging different kinds of commutes, and it would be an obvious response for policy to try to reflect that in some way. And third, as well as policy directly related to modes of commuting, there is a role here for the shuffling of timings of shifts and encouraging firms to innovate along that dimension. And that actually brings me to the next area, which is the ability to socially isolate when you are at work. So this is clearly going to matter a lot in terms of getting people to work safely. Again, this appears to vary a lot by the kind of job that people are in. This is purely illustrative, a purely illustrative way of showing that. This is taken directly from some other work in the US. Again, each dot here is an occupation, and again, these authors used information on the kind of tasks that are done in each occupation to classify them according to two dimensions here: how important teamwork is, and also how important customer contact is. Again, this is using pre-crisis data, so these are things that could be malleable, but this gives you a sense of how the picture looks. And you can see actually these are quite closely correlated to jobs which require lots of teamwork, also tend to require lots of customer contact. So there may be a reasonably clear hierarchy here in terms of which workplaces are easier to make safer. But I think perhaps the key point I would draw your attention to here is how much variation there is. So, for the most part, it's going to be firms and industries which are best placed to know how to innovate to make their workplaces safer, given their own rather idiosyncratic context. And we, again, want to encourage that innovation to happen. The dots on this graph are not universal constants. There are ways that things could be adapted to make workplaces safer in many instances. And we really need that to be happening in order to get as many people back to work as we can, consistent with the safety requirements. So again, I think the government can help here to the extent possible with certainty and forward guidance. The clearer it is that workplaces are going to have to abide by certain standards of social distancing for some period, the more likely it is that firms are going to realize that it's therefore worth them investing and innovating now than if they're not sure how long it's going to last for, than if they are under the illusion that after, just a couple of weeks after lockdown, everything's going to be getting back to normal. Being as clear as possible, subject to the obvious uncertainty that there is about the details, is going to be helpful in making sure that this innovation happens wherever it can. And I think there's also going to be a potential role here for government in directly encouraging and facilitating these innovations, again, given the externalities involved. Perhaps it could think about things like industry grant schemes for innovation in this area of a similar kind to what it already has in other areas. And of course, underpinning all of this, a very effective and clear system of regulation, so people know what is required, and of monitoring, so that people know that if they don't do it, there may be consequences. Again, that's all going to help spur the innovation in the first place as well, and to spur the right kinds of innovation. Perhaps also a role for government in coordinating information in terms of sharing best practices. As new innovations are made, the government can use its sort of central role to help spread those through the market as quickly as possible. And the last area I want to just walk through is thinking more at the level of people and families and households, and the difficulties, the risks, the constraints that they might face in going out to work. So there's a lot of individual level variation and family level variation in these costs, in these risks and constraints, of course, and we need to have a very good handle on what they are, what those risks and constraints are, and how prevalent they are. So to give you some sense of this, I'm now using data on households from this is from the Labour Force survey. So if we focus here on those non-key workers whose jobs don't typically allow home working, and look at potential flags for risks or constraints that they're going to face to working outside of the home. So overall, there are a lot of these around. So first of all, about a sixth of this group, they're either aged over 60 or live with someone who is, which is an obvious flag in terms of the potential health risks of getting COVID-19. Another sixth roughly live with a key worker, which we might think is particularly significant because we really don't want key workers getting infected. If they're absent from work, that's particularly costly. They tend to come into contact with quite a few people as well in many cases, so they're more likely to spread the virus around. So it's about another sixth of these people live with a key worker. So that gets us to about a third, and then about another third of people on top of that live with either a preschool child or a school-age child, and so the childcare constraints when schools and childcare are closed, of course, come into play. When they're open again, there may, depending on where the epidemiology comes out on this, that while that eases a constraint, it may create an additional risk, of course, if there's some risk of the virus being spread through the children in the school. Although our understanding is that the science on that is still the jury is still somewhat out on that. Now, one reason for this really rather high prevalence of risks or constraints is that there's not that much overlap actually between them, and that's basically because it's the older people who are vulnerable from a health point of view, as you can see from the second row down on this picture, and it's the age groups below them who have the childcare constraints, unsurprisingly. The one group here who stand out as being more unfettered by these risks or constraints, of course, are the very youngest workers. So that's those aged under 25. They look like a good candidate in that sense for getting things back up and running. But remember, amongst other things, what I showed you at the start, which is that about a third of those are in sectors that are currently entirely shut down. And in a lot of cases, those are the kind of sectors that are probably not going to be coming back the day after lockdown in very large numbers. We're talking, about things like hospitality here. So, that's important to remember. And, again, enabling and facilitating that group to find at least temporary alternative work in some cases is likely to be quite important. And it's going to be important, particularly if we're thinking about young people as a way of getting the economy restarted quickly and safely. One other point I'll make on these risks and constraints is that London does have a couple of things working in its favour in these regards. In particular, it's a bit younger and it actually has fewer key workers in it as well. So in that sense, it looks a little better placed than the rest of the country. And of course, we've already seen another factor playing in its favour is that a lot of London workers can work from home as well. Although, as we've seen, one of the key issues London faced is the mode of commuting. Now, finally, just before I wrap up, I want to make a point about productivity. Essentially, we talked about getting people back into work, but we don't just want jobs. We want good jobs. This is what happened after we came out of the last recession. This shows productivity performance in the UK relative to a few of our major international competitors, and you can see that after the Great Recession of the late 2000s, we fell way behind both our own previous trend and other countries. So we really don't want that to happen again. There's lots of things one could say here. Of course, one could have a whole day of seminars on productivity and why it performed this badly after the last recession and what could be done about it. I think one thing I would just say here quickly is that we want to be a little bit smart about how we approach emerging from this crisis in terms of where support goes. There are already some structural shifts occurring in the economy due to other changes in the world. So the goal isn't necessarily to return every sector to exactly where it was before the crisis. Some were already in decline, quite clearly in decline, like retail, for example. Some others probably due for a shakeout of one kind or another. So there'll be a lot of lobbying and special pleading, no doubt, and naturally it may well come most from sectors that were already struggling. And one thing the government's going to want to have in mind is to not spend lots of resources on sectors that are about to fade away further anyway. That clearly wouldn't be the smartest use of that effort. But more broadly, of course, productivity is going to be a massive challenge coming out of this crisis, and a lot of what we said actually in the end relates to that. So I want to wrap up just by giving a bit of a recap on what the key roles for government are going to be here, and some final thoughts about policy design. And I've brought up 5 overall areas, I think, where the government can potentially have a key role to play in getting us out of this crisis productively and safely. So first of all, certainty. We need people and firms to be making important decisions at the moment. Right? There are workers who need to be thinking about where to seek work and when, whether they ride it out on furlough and wait for their previous work to come back, or whether that's going to be a long time and they think it's worth reinvesting in finding work elsewhere. We need firms to be innovate. Innovation is going to be really fundamental to the success of the post-lockdown, pre-vaccine period. Almost by definition, we're going to be asking people to work in different ways in order for them to work at all in many cases. And so innovation is going to be absolutely central to that. That relies on certainty. Firms need to know what they're trying to achieve in terms of what the regulations and so on are going to be, and how long those kinds of requirements are going to be in place as well, to know when it's worth investing. Coordination is another overall theme, I think, an area where the government can really help. Information sharing, closely related to that. So the sharing of best practices on innovations when sectors and firms come up with smart new ways of doing things. I think the government can also really potentially help the huge labour market reallocation and matching challenge that we face of potentially matching up millions of workers with lots and lots of firms that are all starting up. That there's been so much disruption to the labour market at the same time. I think there's a stronger than usual role for the government, not in a sort of command and control way of directly putting people in jobs, but of greasing the wheels, of perhaps doing things like creating platforms for job posting and matching in specific sectors and occupations, especially where the market will take an especially long time to sift through the huge reallocation exercise that it might be facing. For example, when there are lots of small firms in the market, and we've seen some of the really inefficient processes that can go on there recently, and examples like fruit picking, where it can just seem to take a needlessly long time to fill shortages when there are clearly lots of workers available. Regulation and monitoring. I mean, of course, this is key in a direct sense to ensure that whatever is deemed desirable for public health is done and complied with, but also clear regulation with a good monitoring regime is going to be important in actually helping spur the innovation that we need to happen. As I've already mentioned, people won't innovate as much if they're unclear what's needed or whether they'll be reprimanded if they don't do it. Aligning incentives. We talked about this as well. There are externalities everywhere here because we're talking about a contagious virus. That's sort of fundamental to the nature of the problem we're facing. And so whether it's kind of working from home or commuting in different ways, there are going to be social consequences of people's actions that didn't exist before there was a contagious virus of this kind knocking around society. And so there's going to be bound to be some role for government in tweaking incentives to reflect that, giving people the incentive to do the things that are now particularly socially desirable. And in some limited cases, I think there is likely to be a role for some direct intervention from government as well. Certainly more likely to be roles for that here than in normal times, I think. As one example might be that in some limited and well-targeted cases, if the government can get enough good data together to identify these kinds of problems, which is another issue it really should think about addressing, it may be able to see that there are going to be areas where there are workers of certain skill sets who are just not going to have job openings anytime soon in that area. The vacancies that are arising in that area just don't match up well at all with the skill sets of those workers. And if it doesn't think that retraining can solve the problem, then there may well be a case for thinking about whether there are productive things that some of those people could do in terms of helping with public investments in something like infrastructure that will pay off later. So I think there's potentially a role for that kind of direct intervention in well-targeted and well-identified specific cases. So I will leave it there, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions, which Paul is going to curate.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob and Rachel. Yes, we've got just 5 minutes or so for questions. There's quite a few that have come in. I'm just trying to see this properly in the chat. One is I think directly directed at Rachel, really talking about what kinds of investments. You talked, Rachel, about how at the moment firms might be disincentivized from making investments because of free riding type risks. What kind of investments might those be?
So I think there are going to be all sorts of investments. Let me just give you one simple example to illustrate. So imagine you work in a workplace where some workers who undertake some kind of managerial role could easily work from home. But in order to do so, it would require some investment by the firm or by the workers in the technology to work from home, to communicate with the workers that need to be in the workplace. And so it would have some impact on their productivity. So imagine also that those workers who could work from home are mostly young people with children. So the benefits to the firm from investing in rearranging the workplace are negative. The costs outweigh the benefits. The workers are going to be less productive. They have to invest in some kind of technology. The benefits to the worker are also negative because they're at low risk, they're young, their productivity will probably decline, particularly if they have young children running around at home. They can't actually interact with the guys at work. But from a social point of view, it could be better that they work from home because the productivity decline will be less than the benefits of reduced congestion on public transport or the reduced engagement in social contact that spreads the virus. And so that's a classic case where the government should try and align those incentives more closely.
Rachel, you also mentioned that there were some sectors that might now be in decline for a while, aviation perhaps, other forms of use of bars and so on. But can you say anything about those sectors that might might be moving in the right direction and how government might actually go about supporting that?
Right. So I think the question was actually about stimulating economic activity where it might be most productive, right? And so,
Yeah, indeed.
where does the government want to stimulate economic activity in this instance? So this is a little tricky. First of all, knowing where activity will be most productive, and also in terms of there can be negative effects of stimulating activity. So first of all, I'm not a macroeconomist, but we know that stimulating activity where supply is constrained is not going to be beneficial because it'll just drive up prices. So it's going to depend on what we think about the longevity of the need for social distancing and whether and how we think that people's demand for different goods are going to change. So if we think that we're never really going to fly as much as we did before, which is currently my view of the world, then maybe we don't want to stimulate demand in that industry. On the other hand, if we think that that industry is going to come back to full, to the size it was before, then maybe there is a role for ensuring that it remains viable in investments. But we also might want to take this opportunity to achieve some other long-term objectives, such as meeting environmental targets. And so one way that the government clearly could think about stimulating economic activity is to make investments in infrastructure where there's capacity in terms of unemployed workers. And we know that the infrastructure investments would be productive. So invest in the broadband infrastructure, build new schools, invest in public transport, choose investments that we know are going to have long-term benefits, and use government procurement and government spending to get people back into work where they currently don't have other gainful employment.
Brilliant, thank you. And Rob, as you can imagine, there are quite a few questions about what all of this means for the furlough policy. We know that government is thinking very hard about how to move away from this possibly 40 billion plus worth of support for, as you were saying, about a quarter of all jobs, all private sector jobs in the economy. It's going to be a very difficult thing to manage, a very fine judgment. What does the set of analyses that you've run through tell us about what might be the right ways to begin to unwind that?
Yeah, it's obviously very difficult, in part because we're trying to sort of tread a knife edge here between something which is extremely expensive and as a large insurance scheme, it can provide sort of barriers to doing some of the things that we do want, like people seeking other work in some cases perhaps, and from a firm's point of view, it can...
Rob, your sound has gone really bad. I don't know whether there's anything you can adjust.
I'm not sure there's much I can do about that. Is that any better?
No.
No. Well, shall I have a go at, because I think that wasn't usable. I'm sorry. Shall I have a go at reflecting on that? I think one of the big questions for government in moving away from furlough policy is the extent to which it is actually possible to do that differentially by sector, because you might think that the current system of really quite generous payments is appropriate for those sectors that have to remain locked down. So supposing you work in a bar or a restaurant, you might think that's reasonable. But where government gradually wants other sectors to move to more normal working, then the current system looks too generous. It's not easy to do it by sector, but they should certainly do all that they can to achieve that. What are the other ways that you could move away? Well, you could again, outside of those sectors that are fully locked down, you could move to some cost sharing. Government will pay half of the salary if and only if employers pay some fraction of the salary. That gives the employer some incentive to get people back to work. But if they judge it still too expensive, given the sorts of externalities that we've been talking about, then there is a cost sharing between government and employer. You could simply move from the 80% rate that we have at the moment to a lower rate, 70 or 60%. Don't forget that 80% is 80% of gross salary. So the actual replacement rate in terms of wages will be more than that, particularly if you're living with someone else who is still earning. And at the moment, of course, people have limits in what they can spend. So 80% may be more generous than is necessary in the slightly in the slightly longer term. That the judgment there is about cost versus the amount of incentives to move into work versus the impact on the individuals. I think, as Rob was trying to say, this is an incredibly difficult and fine judgment to make, because you need to get right the minimizing the long run impact on the economy of having too many people losing their jobs altogether, whilst minimizing the long run, which would happen if you move too quickly away from the policy. But if you move too slowly, then you lock people into these sectors and jobs where actually there isn't much hope of them continuing to stay in employment. It costs you a lot more, and again, you may delay recovery. I'm afraid there are quite a lot of other questions, but we have run now to 20 past 10, which I think was the advertised end of this event. So thank you everyone for watching. Thank you particularly to Rachel and Rob and their co-authors on this paper, actually, which you can see the full paper on the website. Again, please do look at our website for a whole range of outputs related to this, and we will be coming back with more of these events over the coming weeks. Thank you very much indeed to all of you. Thank you.